and a brief little bit here to honor one of the greatest legislators that this body has ever seen. Martin Olaf Sabo died over the weekend. For those who don't know, Representative Sabo, Speaker Sabo, served in the Minnesota House from 1960 to 1978, elected when he was 21 years old for the first time. He served as the minority leader from 1969 to 1972 and the Speaker from 1973 to 1978, the only Speaker to be unanimously elected, if you can believe that, by this body in 1975. In a regular session. There was once during the World War II where in a special session they did that. He was elected to Congress in 1978 and served there until 2006 and had a very distinguished career in Congress as well. Speaker Sabo, for the 6 years that he presided over this body, I think most people would agree were the most productive legislative sessions in Minnesota history. During those 6 years, I think it's a fair argument to make that modern Minnesota was born. In 1970, Minnesota was in the middle of the pack in economic status, in education, and any number of factors. And in great part, I think, due to the long-term vision of those legislators, both Republican and Democrat in the 1970s, Minnesota now finds its place among the leaders in education, in economic performance, in quality of life, as we know from reading the newspapers. And I think it really was the long-term vision those folks had back in the 1970s with a lot of other factors, but that was a really important thing for getting us where we are today. Speaker Sabo recognized that the work of the legislature is a vital and honorable calling, and it's worth doing well. And I think he presided over this body in a way that showed that. He also brought this legislature into the modern era. We started having annual sessions with real-time committee work. We started having open committees. People may not know this, but before 1972, committees were held behind closed doors. There was no public access whatsoever, and they would call in a witness every once in a while and then close the doors up again. That changed in the 1970s, and I think for the good. He developed something that we really benefit from even yet today, which is a strong, nonpartisan, expert House research staff. Before the 1970s, the state of Minnesota didn't have the kind of research expert help, and I know each of us, if you think about the work that you do here, I'm not sure that any of us could imagine getting by and passing and drafting up legislation and getting it through the process without the help of our nonpartisan research staff. And that was all thanks to Speaker Sabo. He was also one of 4 legislative leaders in the country who founded the NCSL back in 1974, which also, I think, brought our legislature and many others into the modern era. When I think of my political heroes, Martin Sabo is absolutely at the top of the list. He was respected by all. When he spoke, and maybe it's because he rarely spoke, people listened. And he truly believed that our politics are about getting important things done that matter to people, and he delivered on that promise. With that, Mr. Speaker, I know there's a few other people that want to speak about former Speaker Sabo. Thank you.
I recognize the member from St. Louis, Representative Murphy M.
My first meeting of Martin Sabo was a political meeting in the sense that as a party activist, I had served positions in the DFL from the precinct up to state Central Committee and State Executive Committee. And so I thought I was somebody. And I thought, as long as I was this year in 1976 running for state representative of District 14B, that I'd have a little toe in the water, so to speak. Nose under the tent, so to speak. So when Martin Sabo came up to Duluth to meet endorsed new candidates that were running for office. I went to the meeting, and I was greeted, and I was sat around for a while with them and listened to the chit-chat and the back and forth. And then the meeting was ready to start. And he said, "Mary Murphy, you have to leave now." Oh my gosh, what happened to my toe? What happened to my nose? I have to leave? Yeah, you're not endorsed. The other 4 people aren't here that you're running with. If they were here, you all could be here, but it isn't fair. So I left, but I won. I won the primary, and then I won the district representative seat. And then I got down here, and my second meeting was with Martin Olaf Sabo, Speaker, and by that time, I had met so many representatives. And the fervor of admiration was unknown to me. No one said anything negative in any way about Speaker Sabo. And we were where we were that day because of the leadership of Speaker Sabo and his firmness and his inclusiveness and his fairness. And so I went in for my appointment with my committees all picked out. I knew exactly what committees I wanted. And he said, "Those are nice committees, and someday you'll get them, but not this year. You will be on the committees in which we lay the groundwork, and you learn how policy is made." And so for the rest of that session and the next, I learned about shade trees in Minneapolis. Everything possible about shade trees in Minneapolis. And policy of all, and how we get along. At the time that I came in, and Martin Olaf Sabo was Speaker, the greater Minnesota legislators were in abundance. The metro people were minorities. But Martin Olaf Sabo, coming out of Minneapolis, made sure that the rural people mixed in with the urban people. And he would walk about the state office building as it was then, not as it is now. And at least once every 2 weeks or so, he would gather 15, 12, 10 rural people to go out to supper. Sometimes he'd bring a couple other city people with him, but mostly it was just the rural people. So we could pick his mind about anything or ask him any kind of questions. And then he sent us back to the office to get your letters done. When there was rancor on the floor, and occasionally there was, and I can remember a situation that for 3 days there was rancor from day to day. Not a whole lot, not like sometimes we have it now, but he would send a couple people out early in the evening and see see if we can have a social. And maybe around 10 o'clock or so, we got a notice saying social, KC Hall, or social, Union Hall up Rice Street. And when we arrived for the social, the Democrats and Republicans all together, not everybody, but people that wanted to be social and without rancor. There might be food, there might be beverages, a dance band, and it was understood that in a couple hours it would be over. And we were to go back and do our mail or go catch a nap so that the next day we would start afresh, totally afresh. And there was no rancor anymore. I can remember at least 4 times that happened. He cared about how people interacted with other people. And on his last visit here, which was about 3 or 4 springs ago, he came and he was sitting down there, and I went down to chat with him, and we talked about whether he'd seen any baseball games lately, and we talked about his family and his daughter that had been a page here, and his Sylvia, his wife, and we talked about that. And then he said, "Who are these people, Mary?" Because there was only 3 of us that he knew. And so I was pointing out who various people were, and he said, "Now you all sit, the Democrats sit here, and the Republicans sit there. Is that it?" And I said, "Yes," because in his day, we were all mixed up. We might have a Republican here, and there'd be down in this row, and there'd be some others, and the Democrats were over there. Always the new people seemed to be in the dog pound, whether we were Democrats and Republicans together or not, but that area was for the new people. But he said, what other differences are there besides that they talk a lot longer and a lot more than when I was here? And I really didn't have a really good answer for him, except that it seemed to me the major difference was that rural people were fewer and metropolitan and suburban people were way into the majority. And he said, "That does make a lot of difference, doesn't it?" And I said, as a rural woman, it sure does. It's much harder, but I'm sticking to it. And he said, as long as you understand how to do policy, and as long as you stay in conversation with all the members, whether they're in your party or not, and as long as you keep the session going without rancor, it'll be fine. Martin Sabo, my friend, thank you for what you taught me.
I call on the member from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
Mr. Speaker, members, Martin Olof Sabo was a giant in Minnesota politics, and he represented in Congress the 5th Congressional District, but he truly represented the entire state of Minnesota as a member of Congress. And in part that may have been the role that he played as Speaker of the House. But I was elected in 1972, so my first session was 1973, and that was the first year that Martin Olav Sabo was elected Speaker of the House. And there were several accomplishments that we could identify with Speaker Sabo during that period of time, but I still remember the first time I met him when I was running. It was at a spaghetti dinner in Crystal, Minnesota, which is the part of the district that I still represent. And I remember him kind of working the people that were there, you know, talking to everyone. And a bit of advice that he gave me, he said, Lynn, now when you have an event in your district, be sure you touch bases with everybody there. That's vitally important, that bit of advice. Well, then I was elected, and so my first meeting with Speaker-elect Sabo at that point, and we talked about committee assignments, and I remember a bit of advice that he gave me that would be good advice for everybody in this body today. He said, now, Lynn, when you go home, and at that point I was representative-elect, he said, study the rules. And the one thing that I remember, well, many things that I remember about Representative Sabo, Speaker Sabo, was he knew those rules inside and out. And that was one of the reasons that he was the effective speaker that he was. And I took his advice, quite frankly, when I read them without having a chance to talk to many people, probably didn't understand half of what those rules or the subtleties of them might have been, but it gave me a good foundation. And he was always available. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned about Speaker Sabo is that he was also president of the National Conference of State Legislators. And one of the things that he promoted among members here, he said, get involved, attend those meetings, and he said, you will learn a lot from your colleagues in other states. And so he was a big promoter of our attending those meetings, and also was successful, I think it may have been the first time NCSL ever met in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, but that was while Martin Sabo was president of the NCSL. One of the things that comes to mind too, and Representative Thiessen mentioned it, but it was staffing. When I was first elected, we had very limited staffing, and we didn't really have the independent analysis that you get now with the nonpartisan research staff. And that was a big initiative of Martin Sabo, wanting to make sure we had independent, good information, and he greatly expanded the legislative staff as far as the nonpartisan staff is concerned. The other thing, he was very interested in the space that we had at the time. When he was first elected Speaker, and during my first term, and Representative Kahn came in the same year that I did, we were down in the lower level. There was a large room that was later converted into Senate offices. But we all had a small metal desk, a two-drawer filing cabinet, a bulletin board in front, a telephone, and one chair for a constituent. And then it was just one desk after another, if you can envision a downtown office building with everything open space. That's what we had. And if you had two constituents that came in, you had to grab somebody else's chair, and not much of a chance for any private or quiet work time. So the opportunity presented itself to move into the state office building, and that was during his time. And it was just another step forward in terms of creating a better atmosphere for legislators to work in. I always want to say Speaker Thiessen, but Representative Thiessen, you mentioned that he was unanimously elected Speaker in '75. And I still remember that day because we were in the process of organizing, and some of the Democrats got up and nominated Martin Olav Sabo for re-election as Speaker. And Henry Savico, the minority leader at the time, Republican leader, got up and he seconded the nomination of Martin Olav Sabo for Speaker. And I think that reflects not only the majority we had at the time, admittedly, but secondly, I think the respect that people had for Sabo as Speaker of the House. During that first term, there was a lot of talk about the Minnesota Miracle. Now that happened before Representative Kahn and I were elected the previous session, but it was still fresh. In fact, during that fall campaign, a lot of conversation among school board members and people interested in education about the Minnesota Miracle, but he was heavily involved in working with Governor Anderson at the time and the majority in the House, because he was minority leader, and the minority and majority in the Senate. And they worked in a very cooperative way in a very long and drawn-out special session, but Martin Olav Sabo had his fingerprints, I kid you not, all over the Minnesota Miracle. Another thing that comes to mind when I think of Martin is I think of the budget. And, you know, some of his priorities, just mentioned education, very interested in taxes, transportation, to mention a few. And when it was mentioned that that was one of the most productive periods of time in Minnesota history, that's absolutely true in terms of what transpired during those years when he was Speaker. Openness in government. That was alluded to earlier as well, but he was very much into reform. And yes, the committee hearings were closed. In fact, the Rules Committee, if it's still there, you can turn it around and it says rules on the door going out into the retiring room. Is that still there? Yes. And the sergeants would be guarding the retiring room while the Rules Committee met. Nobody, not even another member that wasn't on the Rules Committee, could go in. So he was very much into the opening of the process and very reform-minded. So we used to have what we call the Committee of the Whole. And we would dissolve into the Committee of the Whole, and prior to that there were no recorded votes. So you debate a bill and then, or several bills, and then you would adopt the report from the Committee of the Whole, and nobody knew who had voted for what amendments and so on until you came up for the final votes. Usually the following day then you'd take up the report from the Committee of the Whole. So all of that was opened up under Martin Olav Sabo. But one of the kind of fun stories about his opening up government, I happened to my first term serve on the Judiciary Committee. And Martin Sabo announced that he was going to reform the Judiciary Committee. And this is kind of classic Martin Sabo. He was going to put lay people on the Judiciary Committee, probably for the first time going back to statehood. And there were a few of us. I was one of them. I think he put 4 people on, if I recall. 3 of us were teachers, and I forget the occupation of the 4th layperson. But then there was the real story behind that reform. The DFL caucus didn't have enough lawyers at the time to create a majority on the committee, so Martin Olav Sabo announces a reform measure. And kind of classic Martin, there's also the story when we had a resignation of the chair of the tax committee, and several members, or it was appropriations, several members wanted to be the chair of the appropriations committee. It was the second year of the biennium, and so Martin resolved that by appointing himself as the chair of the appropriations committee, and that meant that he didn't have to choose and create an issue among some of the members at that point in time. He was very proud of his heritage. When I would campaign with him, he would always introduce himself as Martin Olav Sabo. And he was actually born in North Dakota, just south of the Canadian border, but in the U.S., being that that's sometimes discussed these days. And it was the far northwestern corner of North Dakota. And Speaker Sabo was very proud of where he was from, that heritage. But he originally became a Minnesotan as a result of becoming a student at Augsburg College. And he was, to this the end of his life, very involved with Augsburg College. And there is the School of Public Affairs, I think they call it, the Sabo School of Public Affairs at Augsburg College. And they just had an event there very recently. The last time I think that I really had a good conversation with Martin Sabo, I was invited to go to a lutefisk dinner in Wisconsin, a Lutheran church, rural area. And Martin used to go over there every year, and I was invited several times. And finally last year, and I'm very glad that I was able to make it, I went to that lutefisk dinner. And now I'm similar background to his. I've got Norwegian and Swedish. He was solidly Norwegian. But at any rate, the lutefisk I never acquired a taste for. So when they passed the plate, you know, I took a little bit of lutefisk, and then they also had some meatballs and so on, and I kind of emphasized on my plate the meatballs. But at any rate, when I finished that little bit of lutefisk, with a great big grin, Martin hands me this fresh plate of lutefisk, and he said, "Here, Lynn, you should have some more." And I thought I had had a major achievement in eating the first dish, but I did take some more, and but it was that grin that he had on his face, and he knew exactly what was happening. And I grew up in a household, my father had lutefisk every year, and you know, it was the classic, try it, you'll like it, and that's what I think Martin was doing with that grin. But you know, one thing that he did do politically was that he did stay in close touch with his constituents, and I would say with our constituents. But when he was Speaker and later when he was in Congress, almost every meeting, maybe every meeting I was at, he would open that meeting with, "What are you hearing?" He was very interested in what we were hearing from our constituents. And he would share some of the things that he was hearing then on the federal level when he was in the U.S. Congress. But when you think about it, that's a good way to open a meeting when you're talking to political activists and so on. I remember he came to the home of a friend of mine. We were having a political event there, and there were a group of people kind of sitting around, political activists. And even there, he said, kind of, "What are you hearing?" You know, kind of opened the conversation with them with that same line of interest. So very interested in the people of his district, the people of Minnesota. And I said at the outset, truly a giant in Minnesota history and Minnesota government, Martin Olav Sabo. We owe a great debt to him.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and members, I had the honor of being the first housemate, district mate, whatever you call it, of Martin Olav Sabo, and Alan Speer was the state senator for both of us. There are many, many stories, which of course I can't ever get into all of them, but let me tell you one which might be a good lesson to the current speaker. I had brought a rule, the other thing about the House, which was all mixed up, is that everyone was smoking all over it. So I had brought a no smoking rule introduced the bill, but I also brought a rule to the Rules Committee. And as I'm introducing the rule, Martin is sitting there blowing smoke rings, perfectly formed smoke rings at me. And so it was a day of low news, and so that story was the prime story in the paper that day. It was entitled, "She Huffs and He Puffs." Apparently what happened was that he got such a flood of negative commentary, phone calls coming into his office, that his administrative assistant at the time came to me and asked me to withdraw the rule and withdraw the bill so that the issue would go away. You know how likely I was to do that. What Martin's reaction to it was to become a co-author of the Minnesota Clean Indoor Air Act, and which was probably responsible for the ease of its passage, because everyone knew what his personal habits were. Another story that happened at that time, believe it or not, I had a bunch of controversial bills that first year, and so there was another one that I was in difficulty with, and between this committee of the whole and the final passage, people were maybe kinder to freshman girl legislators or something like, but one of my colleagues called me up to say, "I'm attacking your bill for final passage, and I'm using these court cases to go against it." And he cited a whole bunch of court cases. So I called Martin. I said, "Oh, I'm totally panicked about this. Where can I go find," this is Sunday afternoon, what's a source where I can go find Supreme Court cases and so forth? And Martin just said very quietly, "Have you counted the votes?" And I said, "Yes, we have 2 to spare." And he says, "If you've counted the votes, don't bother about the arguments." So then the final also thing that I was doing that year was I was doing and Senator Alan Speer and I were doing it together. We were doing the no-fault divorce bill for Minnesota. The only reason we were doing it was that the people who wanted it couldn't find a single lawyer in either body who would touch it. And so we got into a little problems with it, and I guess we had one conference committee that failed multiple times. And then we set up a second conference committee in the second year of the biennium, and I don't remember if this has been done before, but it was a 3-member conference committee, and he put 2 very smart Republican lawyers on it and me. And he said, so I made some comment about we usually have a majority of Democrats, and he says, you need those guys and they'll help you more than any Democrats would. So, and we did. We passed the bill, and I only learned recently that not one word of that law has been passed since it was passed in 1974 or 75, something like that. Then the other, the final thing, the final point I would like to say. Well, first of all, Martin was a door knocker supreme. We obviously door knocked every door in the district. You know, I was working with him and Alan after my primary at some point. And then when he ran for Congress, I bet he's the only congressman who knocked every door in the congressional district. And then at that time, as we were putting these giant assignments together, I said, well, if he's running for president, I'm going to take Brooklyn, because at least my parents live there. Brooklyn, New York, not. And so the final, when Alan Spear was elected, of course we all knew, but it was not known that he was gay. And so he finally decided he would come out before the next election. So a major story was going to appear in the, I don't remember, it was the Star or the Tribune the next day. Alan, believe it or not, was a little squishy about this, and he came to me and he said, you know, I've been afraid. He knew that Martin knew he was gay. That wasn't the point, but that this big story was coming out. He says, I really can't bring myself to tell Martin that that story is coming out. Could you please call him and do it? And so I tried to call his house multiple times, and I couldn't connect. I kept getting Sylvia. This is kind of a story about Sylvia, which is appropriate because at this time. I kept getting Sylvia, and there was no way I was going to get it. She kept saying, why don't you tell me what it is? And I said, I can't, I just have to talk to Martin. And so finally it was clear he was going off someplace like Antarctica or something, and I wasn't going to get to talk to him. So I finally had to tell it to Sylvia. And this is one of the most embarrassing conversations of my life. She said to me, what's the big deal? Would you hold a press conference to say that you're heterosexual? Why would anyone care about this? So here I am, this ultra-liberal, having to explain to this Lutheran wife of the speaker, why, yeah, it sort of is a big deal. And one of the things I think that needs to be said on this day is what a fabulous wife and companion Sylvia was through the whole process. Well, anyway, the story came out. It was a big story, and it was all fine. So, I'm sorry. I don't know that we'll ever have a speaker quite like Martin again. But I legislated with him. I played softball with him. I campaigned with him, and he was a really good friend, and I really miss him.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And I've got the opportunity to get to know Congressman Sabo just a little bit these last few years. After redistricting, he became my constituent, and it was such an honor to represent him. And I'm also doing an academic fellowship at Augsburg's Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship, which is very appropriately named for Congressman Sabo, because that's what he was about. How we can all be better and more civil citizens. And so I just wanted to read, just very briefly, a couple of lines from the obit in the New York Times today, because I think it really summarizes the essence of Congressman Sabo and maybe something we can take from that legacy. First of all, the headline, I think, says something very profound. Martin Sabo, Minnesota Congressman, known for compassion in an era of partisanship. Compassion in an era of partisanship. And they go on to quote Congressman Sabo saying, "I've always tried to treat my colleagues with respect. I don't ever recall making a public statement critical of a colleague, whether a Democrat or a Republican." And maybe, just maybe, that piece of his legacy could be something we could all carry with us as we remember him and honor him in his incredible career on this day. So with that, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members, for your patience today. But Speaker Sabo was, if anybody deserved this kind of remembrance, I think it's Speaker Sabo. So I would just ask Mr. Speaker for a moment of silence to remember him.
Members, please rise for a moment of silence in honor of former Speaker of the House, Martin Sabo.